Let me go ahead and let's just start off. We appreciate you, making it to the end, so you should all give yourselves a round of applause. Really? Come on. It's the last session of the conference. Come on. We have a little bit of leeway. But we appreciate you being here and appreciate your participation. This last session, or at least the session that we're in right now, we'll cover kind of differing angles of configuration management. Specifically, we called out to go ahead and use just Salt, maybe not use just Salt, Puppet, Chef, etc. Let me just introduce myself real quick. I have a really gruff voice. I'll tell you why I have a gruff voice. I have five boys at home, and they all kind of look like me. And so in order to go ahead and try to keep them in line, I have a gruff voice to be able to do that. In fact, because of that, I think that very fact, that's why I was called here to moderate this panel. I don't think I'm really moderating the panel as much as I'm refereeing the panel. And so if there's a fight that breaks out between Corey and Vlad and Sean, I'm the one that has to jump in and act as referee. Good guys, and we won't have that. But my name's Dave Giles. I'm a technical solutions consultant, which is, in other words, I'm a technical sales guy for the company. Just started, back in November, so I'm about 4 months into Salt. My unofficial pitch to the company is it's a wonderful place to work. I know that doesn't really translate to you, but it's a fantastic place. You heard in keynotes this morning, Tom mentioned about like a no-jerk policy. And let me just second that. And in all seriousness, it's great folks that work at Salt. And so I can just kind of second that. I wanted to go ahead and for this panel, we're going to go ahead and I wanted to introduce our panelists that are sitting in front of you. They're the more important ones in the session today. I'm going to go ahead and just at least give them their names. He's asking for applause already. And then we'll go ahead and let each of them kind of introduce themselves, what they do, who they represent, etc. So we have on the panel in front of you Vlad Kuusk from Lithium. We have Sean Zicari from Cars.com, and then Quinn from Taos. And so let's just go ahead and start with Corey on that end and just let everyone kind of introduce themselves.
Howdy, my name's Corey Quinn. I see an awful lot of familiar faces here, so most of you probably know what you're expecting. I've spent the last 4 years working on Salt in varying capacities, but before that I was using Puppet, before that I was using CF Engine, and before that I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Make smart choices. Last year I spent the summer traveling around the country as a traveling trainer for Puppet Labs. I tend to be relatively agnostic with respect to what I tend to tackle in a configuration management sense. And some of my projects I've wound up bringing Salt in, sometimes I've found it there already, and integrating that with systems that already exist has been an interesting challenge and something that I increasingly tend to enjoy. So it was thought that I would lend some interesting perspective to this panel. We'll find out.
Okay, hello. My name is Sean. I work at Cars.com. I've been there about 4 years. I'll split this into a little about me and a little about Cars and how we relate to Salt. So I've had the privilege of being through most of the departments, the tech departments at Cars. Started with development, moved on to kind of a hybrid systems dev team where we managed some data jobs. Moved on to the ops team when we started to really take the DevOps movement seriously. By the time I got there, as a side note, we had already adopted Salt and been through a couple of different, we looked at Puppet, we looked at some other things, but we can get back into that. For a while, I filled in as a release engineer, so started developing and then got to see, well, how is our stuff released? And it was kind of a messy process, very manual, that kind of thing. And so got to see some of our pain points in that respect before we started using Salt. Then moved on to the ops team, got more firsthand experience provisioning servers and whatnot, and writing Salt states and things like that. That's enough about me. We're a pre-corporate Salt adopter, you could say, because Salt was just starting to become a company when we started to incorporate them. We hosted some of the early Salt sprints at Cars. We kind of got behind them and really enjoyed the community, got involved in that respect. Like most people, we came from what I would call a deep winter, where everything was, all servers were unique snowflakes, and they all had their own configuration, and they lasted 10 plus years. And it was kind of a pain to make any changes because you really didn't know what was going to happen. And we'll get into this, but Salt helped change that. And so out of appreciation for that, I wanted to kind of offer my opinions here.
Hi, my name is Vlad. I'm working at Lithium Technologies. Nice name, collision with the new release of Salt, which is called Lithium also. Lithium is the SaaS company for social software for customer relation management and social media marketing, which is a new one. Essentially, we provide communities monitoring of social media like Twitter, Facebook, and give this ability for the companies to reply back. We have multiple data centers in US and Europe. A year and a half ago, we started to move into cloud. So we have currently working OpenStack, bare metal, Amazon, so different combinations of hybrids. Last year, we also started to move to the switch from proprietary configuration management system to the something more newer, and we started to develop Devops model for the deployment and continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines. My answers to questions on this panel will be based on the current phase of our company, and also on my past experience. Since 2000, I was working with automatic installations, automatic provisioning with Jumpstart, Kickstart, then some obscure configuration management system like Staff, which is software test automation framework, which can be used for configuration management, a little bit of CF Engine. From ground up, did bconfig 2, and didn't work with Puppet, worked with Chef, and currently our company is adopted by Chef as configuration management system, but we hit the problem of remote execution, orchestration, and management on between different machines. So we added Salt as a remote execution engine, and we're developing. My main project now is to create DevOps platform, is the glue between different systems to create the deployment pipelines.
So again, great introduction. Like I said, great panel, and especially kind of the rest of the agenda for today is we're going to go ahead and go through. I've talked with the gentleman up here. We've come up with hopefully some questions that answers. We'll go ahead and kind of cover some of this. The topic of the panel specifically is really about configuration management. Where it makes sense to go ahead and use solo hybrid models, and you'll hear from their experience. Some of the answers to these. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just roll through a few questions. We're going to just put them up on the actual projector. So you'll be able to see them. Our panelists will be able to go ahead and reference back to those. So we'll go through some of those questions. And then I think the most important thing at the end is now that you have kind of this captive group of experts on this topic, which they are, that's why they're here. Yeah, sharpen your knuckles, get your knives ready. Is that I think the best thing that can happen at the end of this is that we'll open it up for just QA. Ask the questions, and this really doesn't have to be just QA to Vlad, Sean, and Corey, but again, all of you probably have experience as well, and we'll just go ahead and lead the discussion. I'm just prefacing this with, let's go ahead and we'll keep it orderly. We have mics in the front and the back. We'll go ahead and pass the mics out, so just raise your hands if you have a question, and we'll kind of go through it. So let me go ahead and just roll this first slide. So the first question that we kind of came up with that we want to allow each one of these three to go ahead and answer, what does the ideal CM software or set of tools look like? And then kind of related, what criteria should you use or could you use when evaluating a solution? So let's go ahead and start with Corey, if you would.
Sure. I'm going to start by saying something a little controversial. I know, try and restrain your shock at this. That I don't tend to view Salt as configuration management. I view Salt as a communications bus that enables a lot of interesting applications. And I view configuration management as one of those applications. Salt, like everything before, stands on the shoulders of what came before it in the same way that those pre-existing solutions stand on top of things. For example, Salt learned a lot from some of the steps and missteps that Puppet made, which in turn learned a lot from CF Engine before it, which in turn learned a lot from bconfig, which in turn learned a lot from foraging for roots in the forest. And we all tend to become better as successive generations tend to come to the forefront. I think that as far as what the ideal stack looks like, that's going to depend greatly upon what's already in the environment. Over 80% of shops today either don't use any configuration management that we would recognize as such, or use something either horribly proprietary or something they developed in-house themselves. And I don't view that as a sustainable model for the future. So I would say, first and foremost, it would behoove companies to get on board with something that is used outside their own walls. And whether that winds up being Salt or something else, I still applaud them for that. Now, is there still room for Salt in those types of companies? I would argue absolutely. And as far as what that might look like, I'm sure we'll touch upon a little later on in the panel.
Okay, so what I see as I guess an ideal set of features or overall features would be not only tooling, which there is, but process, like a dev workflow, which includes testing and debugging, maybe even literally being able to step through high states, that kind of tooling that would allow you to really introspect what you're doing, and also the community that kind of thinks in that direction. So when I think of when I think of Chef, I immediately think of Test Kitchen, because that's just such a big deal that, I mean, it's not like nobody else can do Test Kitchen, and I know that there is a Salt version of that that is being, I'm not sure at what stage that's at, but it exists. But I think of that, and I think, okay, well, I can write something in Chef, and I can immediately turn around and see how it's going to work. And I can do it in a way that doesn't take maybe 20 minutes at a time, from what I understand, to spin up and test. And so that is a big win. And obviously, that is infused in their community enough that I think of that when I don't use it, kind of the first thing I go to, and that's something that we at Cars have struggled with in our current version of Salt, which is how to test. And we actually developed a system called Spore that used vagrants that allowed us to spin up and run high states and things, and that's kind of our in-house answer to that, which obviously is tough to give to somebody else, and I don't know that we'd want to maintain that long term. So I would really love to see that grow out in Salt, and that's seeing that the community adopt that and that be the push is kind of what I think would be big. So for that one.
Okay, I guess I'm close to Corey's answer in the sense that configuration management as defined as just to maintain over state of a machine is not enough to handle the infrastructure. So I would say that configuration management in broader sense should involve other aspects, but not only maintain only idempotent state, but something else. And if you look at multiple different tools and systems, they both have similar features, and they both grow into the same direction in terms of feature sets. And what I mean by that, let's say, for instance, ideal system should have something like controlling single server. And controlling single server has to go into both mode, in pull mode and push mode. And if you look at Puppet, there is in Puppet is M-collective Chef in pull mode, and then they added push jobs, which is push mode. Salt started from the remote execution mode, when it created states, which is pull mode. Ansible essentially like moving push mode, but they sometimes run in the Ansible pull mode, something like that. So essentially the controlling of single server is one piece of a puzzle. Second piece is currently most of the applications they involve, especially in our case when we deploy the pods of servers for different customers, it means that stack of machines consists of several machines, and you have, let's say, load balancer, application layer, database layer. So ability to control sets of the servers and orchestrate between them is essential for configuration management. It's what Salt has now as state orchestrate. Another piece, because a lot of people moving to cloud infrastructures, the ability to control the cloud resources becomes feature of configuration management. So essentially, you request resources from a cloud, and it comes together with requesting individual servers and orchestration of the deployment into many of them. Another piece of the feature set is the second day management. Essentially, it's the troubleshooting and on-demand execution on individual machine after the installation is done. Let's say you need to have emergency page, you have to do security audit. These are one of second-day maintenance features. And this is what Sol has in the remote execution. And latest becomes interesting part. People talk about the event-driven infrastructure, and that is, in Salt situation, is the beacons and engines, and there are some other companies like StackStorms, which they also have reaction on something, and then they correct the infrastructure based on the events. So these are essentially features which I would say should have ideal configuration and automation system should have. And Salt always talks about scalability, but in real situation, not too many companies go above 2,000–3,000 servers. I mean, above 1,000 servers, it's already okay. So scalability on the entry level for companies like 100 servers up to 1,000, it's not big selling point, but it required. So I guess you've heard a lot when people say we have scalability problems with design, but when we come to it, it's good problem to have. But when scalability problem hits, then it's very difficult to solve after that.
That was the easy question. And so now we get to the tough stuff. I'm just kidding. So next question really, again, kind of for the panel, and again, we can maybe go in reverse. You know, what are the reasons and maybe experiences you've had? And, you know, you saw again, in Tom's kind of presentation this morning, you know, the elephant in the room. And really this was the, you know, kind of the crux of our presentation. You know, when is it viable to go ahead and maybe use just Salt, or in kind of in orchestration, or in a hybrid mode, maybe with a chef or a puppet. You heard Vlad talk about a little bit with Lithium that they're kind of doing that today. So that's what we want to talk about is maybe, you know, what are the reasons or experience you've had in using a single tool or a hybrid model, you know, using more than one, and specifically maybe the pros and the cons. So Corey, why don't you go ahead and start off again?
Sure. One of the challenges you're going to see in any environment where you're running multiple configuration management systems and using them as configuration management systems is the idea of dueling CMs. Well, each one has an idea of what a file should look like, and they're both going to fight over that. So you wind up having serious problems as a direct result of this. The other side of it is if you wind up picking just one and it doesn't do what you need it to do, you've effectively painted yourself into something of a corner. I would say far and away one of the most critical determining factors is who's going to be using this and where does ultimate responsibility for the integrity of the system lie. For example, if this may shock you, but if you're an entire shop full of Ruby developers, maybe Salt isn't the right choice for you. Maybe Chef would be better suited to that model. Conversely, if you're in a shop where we're staffing up your entire operations group with people who are qualified to write Ruby code would be prohibitively expensive, maybe Chef isn't the right direction. Going somewhere else would make more sense. It's really going to be a decision that's not just from, it's easy to sit here and paint a greenfield environment and say, well, you should write it with this tool, with this in mind, and this ultimate result. But very few of us get the opportunity to do that very often. You're going to be encountering places where there's already something in place. And provided it's something mainstream, would I suggest wholesale up and replacing it with something else? Almost never. I would argue bringing sanity to it through some form of perhaps remote execution / orchestration might make sense. And if provisioning is extremely manual, look into Salt Cloud and SaltVert and some of the interesting subsystems there. But a wholesale replacement of everything from ideological reasons almost never makes a compelling business case.
So I have a little bit to add to this. Kind of based on an experience we have at Cars right now, we're pretty much using Salt for everything that we are provisioning configuration-wise. We're using Salt for our servers, but we've got an issue in Dev where we've got somebody who's pushing Docker, and Docker is not a configuration management solution, but they do have the Docker file, and so there's a little bit of an issue as to where we draw the line. Well, okay, Docker can provision a machine, but then when we get to production, that's a totally different process to get to provision that out to, to be live. And so it's turning out to be quite a messy issue. And so it seems like determining what you're going to incorporate and what software is going to solve what problem is going to come down to team culture, because somebody might like another tool over the one that most people are using or that prefer, but if it ends up adding ridiculous complexity or just creating a clear wall of divide, then it's really not worth supporting both tools. So this is a problem we're working on solving. One thing I like about Salt is that it does have a modular design in that you can, it's got an event-based system. It's got some things that you can hook into, so you're not necessarily, they provide all the tools, but they don't mind if you use a couple of your own, or if you had an existing system, you can hook into it. Like, for example, Seth gave a talk where he said, you've got an existing bash script that's, how many 100 or 1,000 lines. You can add a line to the end of that, and now it's a first-class citizen in the Salt infrastructure. So you're not throwing out everything. So I like that Salt lets you have that choice, but it really has to be a team culture promoted thing. Yeah.
So I guess I agree with what Sean and Corey said, and for me, the reason for two systems to coexist in the same infrastructure mostly historical. And what happens in the beginning when people decide to go to configuration management system, they decide based on the skill set they have. If it's Python, they go to Ansible. If it's Ruby guys, they go to Chef. And then in a while, a lot of effort is invested into the development of different procedures, and you realize that something is missing, and this missing is not possible to fill in by the system which you chose like a year ago. For this reason, you start to bring second system in to fill in the gaps which one system has. And another piece which is also interesting, even if two systems were on par at the very beginning, in 1 year or 2 years from what you start to use them, some of them involve with different speed and different features. So in a sense, like in 2 years, you have to evaluate, are you still continue to right direction or not? And if you want to switch into different configuration management system, you have to have at least 1 year, I mean, if you're lucky, for two systems to coexist, because you cannot drop old one and to create new one, especially if you're in production mode. For startups, it doesn't matter actually. You can drop, and if you one person shop, then it doesn't matter.
Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, just for time's sake again, because I just want to make sure there's plenty of time at the end for, the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and skip actually question number 3 and actually kind of go to Q4, or this question 4. Crystal ball. And this was kind of the question. And again, this kind of, just, you can see the question already, areas of improvement. And so I wanted to go ahead and yeah, this kind of opens up our, ourselves, to discussion, ridicule, jabs, things like that. But like I said, I think it's healthy for us to go ahead and hear these types of things. So let me go ahead and just throw that out. Areas of improvement really for either Salt or SaltStack, moving forward. So Vlad, you want to go ahead and start this one?
Okay. So I guess for us, for me, personal opinion, for Salt currently, for me personally, it's scary to put directly into production mode with high availability without having Salt master in HA cluster. And as far as I understand, Tom mentioned that SaltStack is working on the Salt master cluster. When this will be available, but its adoption of Salt will be greatly improved because it's very safe and nice to go into production with Salt master HA. Otherwise, everybody comes up with their own systems to sync minion keys and all that stuff. Another piece, which for me is also for Salt, because we're working on the combining the application with request for cloud resources and orchestration, the merge, if Salt would have, SaltStack would merge Salt Orchestrate and Salt Cloud into one system, which you can apply the same way as Tosca standards. Essentially, that when your cloud resources and execution plans are combined together, then it would be nice adoption and win for SaltStack.
So mine's a two-part answer, hopefully not too long. One, I'm going to reiterate the testing aspect I would love to see improve in Salt. Not only a test harness, the ability to, the facility, the tooling to write tests along with the states and run them at the same time, but also the promotion therein, so that when people think of Salt, just like I said, when I think of Chef Test Kitchen, it's like right there. I would love for that to be prevalent and very, just like one of the first things that comes up. Like, you're going to be able to rate your states, and you're going to be able to test them, so you're not going to be in the dark. You don't need to incorporate a third-party tool, server spec, or whatever it is. That's one thing. Another part of this answer is might be a little bit more subjective based on our experience with Salt, being early adopters. Some of this, anything that's not true now, you can just kind of take with a grain of this particular solution we're talking about now. And maybe anything that might still be true, hopefully, is being improved. We were on version 0.15 or some 14.15. We went to 16. We ran into some major issues with it where it just wasn't working the way we expected, delayed some of our, our high states, or we just weren't able to roll it out right away. We turned to the community, and at that time, there were some other things they were concentrating on. We had trouble finding answers. Kind of left a bad taste in our mouth. I mean, we still stuck with it, and we are at a point where it's working well. But what we saw, for example, there were a lot of open bugs, and a lot of projects have open bugs, but they didn't seem to go down with new versions, but the features went up. So that was a pain point for us. What it looked like was, okay, you're really ambitious, you're growing, but you're not really circling back and closing some of those issues. So that was a kind of a faulty point of confidence. We also had, this wasn't my experience. My experience with the community has been great. Sometimes others have reached out for answers and haven't gotten them, or haven't gotten the kind of answer they were looking for. Like, we've had a guy I work with brought up some issues, and the response was, yeah, we noticed that too. And then it kind of died there. The bug would stay open for like a year and then kind of just disappear, be swept under the rug. So those kinds of things are the fresh pain that we have, and it actually has kept us from upgrading, because we just don't know. We're not ready to start updating our states yet. We're getting there. Some of those things. Again, some of that's been solved, but yeah.
One of the things that continues to impress me about Puppet is that they have a published and well-fleshed out style guide for writing modules. It's fantastic. It's opinionated, and it talks about what they want to see as far as what a module should do, how it should be tested, how it should be written. And this includes very defined things such as exact syntax, but other things as well, such as the philosophy behind the design. I'd love to see more of that coming out of Salt. Specifically, I want to see a best practices guide to state creation. If I'm going to write my own formula, I want to know what things should I take into account. And as a part of that, how do I test that? What does it look like? And how can I continue to regression test it so that future versions don't wind up leaving a pile of data on the floor? It takes a certain level of maturity for a project to get to that point where the best practices sands aren't shifting every 6 months. But I have to believe that as a community that we're there. And I think now would be the time to begin taking that rather seriously. If for no other reason, then that style guide serves as a tremendous way of getting someone new to the environment up to speed. That crap. Awesome. Events are outpacing me. I love it.
Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. Again, we've got about 15 minutes left in the session. I'm not going to tell you, left in the day as well. So let's use kind of these last 15 minutes. We'll just run a mic to you. So if you want to raise your hand, have a question for our panelists, we'd love to go ahead and get those and start the conversation running.
So you mentioned earlier, Corey, you know, Puppet was built better because of CF Engine. Salt is built better because of Puppet. What do you think is the next learning experience for the panel to learn from Salt? What do you think is the next iteration's big gain, and why haven't you made it yet? Maybe too, but.
That's a good question. I wound up having the privilege of speaking with someone who works in a highly regulated environment about a week and a half ago. And his argument was that the technology has outpaced the process. Specifically, when you can drop a message onto the Salt bus and wind up effectively having root all over everything, everywhere in a matter of seconds, the process that forms around that needs to be a bit more fleshed out. In large financial institutions, as of, for instance, a lot of the credentials, well, they're deciding who can access this living inside of an ACL statement in the master config isn't going to cut it. That sort of thing tends to live in HSMs. It tends to be something that has much more process around it, and coming up with a way that Salt can speak authoritatively to the business is one piece of that. The other is that we're seeing a transformation across the industry. I would argue there's 4 major tenets of what people consider DevOps today: configuration management, remote execution and orchestration, the idea of provisioning, and service discovery. Of everything in that space today, Salt's the only one I'm aware of that has made significant strides in all 4 of those areas. And I think that we still need to wrap our heads as an industry around those before we take a next step. I mean, as much fun as it is to guess and speculate wildly, I don't have a clear sense of what comes after this. Thank you.
Hi, I don't really have a question as such. I just wanted to second what Sean was saying, really, is that we're in a position as well at the moment where we have an issue with upgrades because there's breaking changes that we've had little help about on forums and user groups. So if that's an improvement that I'd personally like to see as well.
I feel your pain.
Anyone else?
So, Corey, you brought up something early on that struck a chord with me with regards to Salt not being a configuration management system, or you not considering Salt a configuration management system. I feel the same way. I feel that every time I've tried to communicate what Salt is to someone, if I use the words configuration management system, they don't understand the scope of what can be done with Salt, with Reactor, with, you know, we have these new things, engines and beacons. So I'd just like to hear from anybody who I mean, at what point do we stop calling it a configuration management system, start referring to it as maybe a framework, maybe
DevOps platform.
Yeah, DevOps, a platform. I mean, I just think at this point we're reaching a point where communicating it as a configuration management system is doing us more harm than good as a community, because it's really a framework to build really cool things in this really asynchronous, event-driven way. At what point do we change?
And break things at tremendous scale extremely quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Right? So at what point do we change the way we communicate this?
May I just start? I guess the idea, I mean, the situation is understandable because currently Salt complements Puppet and Chef as remote execution system. And it started as a remote execution system, and it's not configuration management system for sure, but the name has to come up with from community, from like an industry altogether. Let's say when you say next level will be event-driven infrastructure, is it some platform for event-driven infrastructure? So something like that. And maybe like DevOps platform, but I guess a lot of names will come and go before we stabilize on some, chose the final name for it. But you can say that Salt is configuration management, but for now.
Yeah. And remember, when Salt was first launched, it was originally envisioned by Tom Hatch as a remote execution framework. It took someone else's suggestion before he realized, hey, I could bolt configuration management onto this too. And to be blunt, configuration management has been an area of some interesting debate for a number of years. It was the way of getting SaltStack into the public consciousness. Now that we've done that, it's probably time to start looking at pivoting how we're positioning this in various ways. And I'm seeing people use Salt for a lot of different things. Monitoring. I'm seeing people use it as a deploy system. We saw Dave Boucher earlier this weekend use it as a way to start posting text messages he gets because he is just that popular. I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities here, and I think that capitalizing on that is going to be a massive challenge. Fortunately, there's now a company behind Salt that can take the lead on that, which makes it my favorite kind of problem, someone else's.
Yeah, I was going to answer that as well, as I know internally, and even in my short tenure, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but that's been a challenge, internally, is how to go ahead and have us, break out of that, in the conversations that we always get, we are kind of locked into the conversation, we're configuration management, we compete against Puppet and Chef, or an Ansible, or something like that. How do we go ahead and break ourselves kind of out of that? And so that's all something that I think as a young company that we're still, we're growing, we're kind of reaching out of that, and so you'll see kind of within, at least that's the sense that I get, from Mark, from Tom, from a lot of the, the folks at that level, that yeah, that is our hunt and that is our search, is to go ahead and not, I mean, we're going to still embrace that, but we'll go ahead and really extend ourselves.
It's one component of the whole.
Exactly, and that's the idea, is to go ahead and do that. So
Salt was fantastically ahead of its time, and I would argue that it was the answer to a question that nobody was asking. Well, 4 years later, people are asking that question.
I wanted to add a real quick thought. I like the term DevOps platform, at least for myself. Maybe a quick thing to do would just be to start using that term. Like, I think I'll, start referring to it in that respect, and whether or not that catches on, that's going to be a different matter, but at least it'll get other people at least seeing the term, and maybe others will adopt it. I know there's more that's needed, but that's something that communities contribute to this kind of thing. So.
Please, mumble into the microphone.
There we go. There's a downside to that. Basically, if anyone's ever worked with Tivoli, I don't know what platform it is, but it's unusable. So you can do a few things well and some things okay. And from what I've seen, Salt has been pushing for more features, for doing more and more and more and more. And that's what kind of increases it to a platform. But then at the same time, as Sean has mentioned, doing development in it, like go ahead and debug through most things. Do a stopping point somewhere. Analyze what's happening, where the state is in. Basic development techniques. I mean, they could be applied a little bit different. You can't really do that in Salt. So there's a number of things that it doesn't do well. And if you're going to be a platform for everything, but people can't develop in you, I mean, you become Tivoli. And that's something to consider as people try to rebadge what it has now. I mean, it did really well things like fast communication, right? It was build 0MQ super fast versus SSH or whatever it was at the same time. There's no pool model, you can communicate and whatnot. But, I mean, I think we're kind of spiraling with all the features right now. Somebody recently suggested, hey, the reactor, I can do what Node.js does. Great. Because we don't have, Node.js and 50,000 other async systems. Now we have that through SMS and reactor. I'm not saying it's not useful. But at the same time, the stuff that it does now right now well is not horribly friendly sometimes, and that's something to consider as you try to rebadge it.
No, and I see where you're coming from in this. I agree with you that Tivoli is primarily best used to extract secrets from enemy combatants. But one of the advantages that SaltStack brings to the table is, you're right, it does do a lot, and that's continuing to expand. But each of those things that it does is loosely coupled to the other, in the sense of you can use it for remote execution, but for the configuration management piece, we're going to use Chef because we have something in place that works well there. Or conversely, I don't really even want to do remote execution. So he's giving another talk right now, but Ryan Lane talks about using Salt masterless over at Lyft. I'm not entirely sure why he would do that, but it's working well for him. So I can only assume for his use case that works without the remote execution piece. Down the road, we might see people using Salt solely for the event reactor subsystem or provisioning. And I find all of that to be okay. The idea that I'm seeing from Salt is that we're providing a suite of tools that don't necessarily drag the rest of them along with them unless you want it to, as opposed to the Tivoli model, which is terrible.
Real quick, I just want to piggyback on that and reaffirm what Michael was saying. As long as we circle back and kind of fix it's good to get a feature out quick as long as it's solidified. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
You started on the topic of service discovery, and you said, okay, SaltStack might be a tool for that as well. On the other hand, there are things out there like Consul, and having more of a different set of mind there, like services that are up and running. I don't need to communicate much about them up until the point where actually the status changes. So where SaltStack had this event bus, you can send lots of events across to discover that something has gone away. It's very different, I think.
Yeah, but the funny part is that console, they are planning to introduce the remote execution on their side also. So essentially, we're going to configuration management now. We don't have a piece of configuration management yet, but we're going in that direction also. So everybody converges to the same place.
Yes. The Onion did a fantastic tourism video late last year for Salt Lake City, advertising this as "Welcome to beautiful Salt Lake City, which you are free to leave at any time." I would argue that we have a very similar approach to the various components of SaltStack. The Salt Mine, for example, for configuration management is great, especially for a rudimentary piece of service discovery. Yes, and if you wanted to use something more fleshed out, such as something using Zookeeper or using Console, you're free to ignore that part of Salt or integrate Salt with those other systems in a few different ways. I don't think it necessarily serves as a game changer. And to be fair, if people start using Salt significantly for service discovery, I would anticipate additional development in that area to flesh out that feature set. Right now, the community and the enterprise customers are really what are serving to drive the roadmap, which I take a lot of solace in.
And actually, because I'm familiar with HashiCorp a little bit, and they start console and service discovery, one thing, configuration management, second thing, Salt Cloud will go to like Terraform on the HashiCorp side. So essentially, and then they created the platform again like Atlas. So essentially, what I'm saying that everybody is the same. And it's the question who executes faster and better. And in a sense that we'll see. I mean, it's all, currently it's in flux. I mean, you cannot say that this particular system won already. It's still, there is some competition left.
Yeah, most companies aren't doing anything in this space, or they're using 20-year-old tools to do it. Frankly, I welcome the idea that there are multiple providers in this space because that serves to make everything better. Monocultures, I don't think, tend to serve anyone very well.
Yeah, let's go ahead and we'll make this our last question, then we'll wrap up.
When you have you're coming from different viewpoints of how things should be managed, whether it's Puppet or Chef or CF Engine or nothing at all, how do you manage to structure your data? What do you choose for your source of truth as far as certain information or laying out the data where it should reside? I mean, have you reused things from other systems, or have you reconfigured things and stored it in a different format? What was your experience with that?
I mean, Corey mentioned that it's very tricky situation when you try to use two configuration management on the same machine. You can step on each other in terms of file, trying to manage the same file. This is obvious thing, but if you complement different systems in different areas, let's say configuration management, Chef only, Salt, remote execution, Salt only, somebody else like service discovery is console only, then it's easy. But what interestingly, that we abstracted the information which is core for us into separate, and we maintain it as separate glue. We have separate project for it, but the idea is that we maintain the infrastructure attributes and attributes for different services which are going in as separate outside of all these systems. If you use multiple, so you have to have authoritative source for yourself. And you have to have glue to inject this data into different systems. Let's say for us, we can use Jinja to insert some YAML file into CloudFormation templates directly and use Amazon directly without anything else. So all what we're doing is get authoritative source of data, inject them into CloudFormation, get the stack there, inject into Hit template, get the OpenStack, something like that. So essentially that you have to maintain the authoritative source for yourself. Company, you can convert them into pillars, into different other places, but you have to maintain central location for the company, no matter what.
Yes, and you can use that to inform Pillar or whatever system you are using. I have an open issue on this that I'm holding Dave Boucher personally responsible for resolving because he's always the great scapegoat. But for example, I think that Hyra in Puppet, which is what they use to abstract code from data, is a work of art. I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned on the Pillar side from that. And I'm just trying to drag Pillar a bit more towards sanity in that context. I'm hoping to see improvement there, but you're right. It is a question of how do you structure your data and what form is that in now? If you're starting from nothing, then the sky's the limit. But invariably in most environments, there's already a source of truth. What is the most painless way to present that to your system to address future expandability?
And actually about structure, I have, our lesson was also for DevOps situation when multiple teams go into the same infrastructure and they deploy their own services into the same shared platform or structure. So it's a nice idea to separate the destination data from what is coming. Let's say you have VPCs IDs and definition of subnet IDs, image IDs as separate set of data, and sizes of images or sizes of machines, how big, I mean, what machine types is separate. So essentially the attribute of a service is the sizing of a service is separate from destination. So you maintain data about what separately from data about where.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and let's conclude. Let me just, a couple things really quick. Number one, just say thanks to Corey and Vlad and Sean for their participation today. If you would, just go ahead and give them a round of applause. Appreciate that. So also, I just wanted to go ahead and you know, kind of from the team here at SaltStack, we just want to say again, thanks for coming and supporting this this fantastic conference. Appreciate the investment in time and resources to go ahead and be here. Hopefully, this has been useful through these last several days. Hopefully, good enough. Please also use your application to go ahead and, if nothing else, give these three guys raving reviews for their session.
1 star, would not recommend.
5 stars across the board. So anyway, just want to go ahead and say thanks. Safe travels back home wherever you may be going, and thanks for coming.